Alright, physics style video, I think, hopefully. But, it's always tricky with pyrrho because it just gets into a bunch of, really just jibber jabber. And the problem of having a conversation from any kind of bottom-up kind of way, or just let's stick to one tiny isolated piece of this mechanism and try to establish some kind of truth about what something is, what a photon is, what an electron is. But instead it's always the whole picture, and there's a lot of moving parts in the whole picture. That's sort of the problem. It's not like the mechanics are, I think the mechanics are very simple. I don't think there's a whole lot of real physical laws dictating the movement of the force atoms, whatever you want to call them, the general force elements of physics, that is light, the entire electromagnetic spectrum, and all the invisible tons that are communicating between the things we call particles, electrons and protons, which really aren't particles but collections of particles. Anyway, which make the thing called the atom, which really isn't obviously the atom. It might be like the atom of religion in the sense that the human organism called atom is obviously a byproduct of a much simpler origin mechanism. So anyway, so this whole thing of what is, he uses this word natural philosophy, and I just can't stand it as a piece of rhetoric. Science, there's science, and science is the attempt to accurately describe reality. And philosophy is a discipline within science, and it has to deal with the immaterial truths, the emergent properties, so to speak, of the material reality. That's what philosophy deals with, a concept like ethics, something that's not obviously transmitted by the matter itself, in the sense that you can't see the meaning. It's like me writing an alphabet and you understanding it without having the philosophical knowledge of what an A is, a B is, a C is, and how they function inside of the mechanism of words. And so you have to have a whole knowledge of the all the associated concepts that are, some of them, material, and those material elements add up to this more emergent, complex description. It's kind of like having the argument about the meaning of value or a sensation, and then you have to go all the way to with some people, you have to argue it all the way to the basic neurological pattern, that there's a pattern that is suffering, of neurons firing. And that pattern is going to be a very similar pattern in all the organisms that are going to encounter this obnoxious throbbing pain or something. It'll be a similar pattern. And you can identify that now we know this pattern to be always, no matter where you place it in the universe, that pattern is a negative thing because it's creating this negative conscious experience, blah, blah, blah. So it has a material root. But the conversation is about the immaterial meaning. The fact that we understand the concept of a good and a bad. And that can't be known in any other way through experience. You have to feel good or feel bad to know what good and bad is. Alright, and so that's philosophy. Philosophy is really just always, philosophy is always the subject of understanding the meaning and importance and significance of good and bad. There's nothing else that's philosophically interesting. And the rest of it's just science. The rest of it is just, let's figure out what the truth is. So what science is basically, as I've pointed out, it's just a detective work. You have certain environmental circumstances. You have a gun on the floor, you have a dead body in the other room with a hole in its head, and you have footprints, and you have some fingerprints, and you have some stuff indicating a certain thing happened. And your job is to try to diagnose what happened. And you can walk in and just say, obviously the invisible man has been here, and then you don't have to do much science. You don't have to do much work, because then you can just say, the invisible man obviously did all of this stuff, and he put all this fake evidence here, and he's just trying to frame somebody. But we know the invisible man did it, so let's not even bother thinking too hard. That would sort of be Christianity, or religion. Very unscientific. Very, very bad detective work. The leprechauns did it. But anyway, in physics, I'm afraid they have become religious folk. And they've taken this word quantum mechanics and turned it into a bunch of mumbo-jumbo of magical happenings and events that don't have anything to do with anything real. Really real. So anyway, that's just so that's my. I'll play some little clips out of this, and then we'll get to the substance of it, which he concedes that this example is again just another metaphor. It's another, let's do something with water waves and then apply that, what we learned from water waves, to photons, which is entirely a different mechanical circumstance. The same forces aren't in play. There's different transfer elements that are different. It's a lot harder to make friction in the nuclear war world. And clearly friction is a fundamental part of the mechanics of wave mechanics in water or any medium. And the friction is a huge player in the tearing of the tension. That is the only way that this, the flexing of tension, which is the only way wave mechanics works, is you have to have a medium with tension for there to be any wave mechanic. Okay. And that has something to do with this oil experiment, that's duplicating, in some crude way, patterns that look quantum mechanical. And they just look it. It doesn't have anything to do with real quantum mechanics, though. It has nothing to do with the real quantum mechanics. So when the word quantum mechanics is spoken, I think automatically of photons and electrons. That's what it was originally called, quantum electrodynamics, and all it was realizing that you can quantize the energy that goes in and out of electrons, and you can account for all of it. You can have conservative models of what happens to electrons, and what happens to electrons is they interact with photons, but they also interact with these other tons of gravity and magnetism, and these are in substance almost the more important players. Visible light is a small light itself, is the electromagnetic spectrum, in terms of the part of it that is at frequency, is a small portion of the spectrum of quanta, in the sense of forces. So when they say, when you talk about electromagnetic spectrum, you're really just talking about force at frequency, and magnetism would be force without frequency, and gravity would be force without polarization or frequency. That would be the most native form of the force. So the most native form of the force is what the universe is, the big universe is full of. That's the rawest form, and then it's a refined form in magnetism, and then it's a further refined form that is photoelectric kind of stuff. But anyway, but they have complete misconceptions, and again, their materialistic model is still, they're not understanding that everything that happens in the universe, including the big universe, is only happening because it's happening on the nuclear universe first. All of the effects, all of the interactions that take place are nuclear interactions. It's nuclear interactions that make my hand move. It's nuclear interactions that send the electricity through my body. It's all photons and protons and electrons and neutrons, the stuff that atoms are made out of, that are creating the field effects that create all the other stuff that happens. It's all nuclear. There's no such thing as a non-nuclear force. That's a huge misconception here, because they keep thinking of these material models and putting material obstacles, and they keep thinking the material obstacle is some sort of real material, that matter means something. And what all that matter means is that the stuff on the side you call matter is polarized, the stuff not on the side that's matter is not polarized, and the two polarizations are different based on their configuration. So when you put one piece of matter next to another piece of matter, you're taking a force that's different in this one and putting it next to a force that's different in this one, and you always have a transition area that they have to go through where their force dynamics has to be translated, and that's what changes how light diffracts, for example. Going from atmosphere through glass, it's diffracting on the surface because it's a change in the force, field that it has to travel through. The electrons that it's hitting are in a different field dynamic, which means they will move differently. And that's all this is about. Photons interact with electrons. So this is something I'm going to keep emphasizing, but Feynman said it 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, that, look, cut through all the bullshit. Photons travel in straight line between point A and point B. Photons hit electrons. Electrons move funny. And that's a Feynman diagram. And that's the reality. Feynman knew it. He knew that this mumbo-jumbo about photons going all over the universe, no, they go in a straight line from point A to point B. And it's the point B electron that they hit that fucks them up and sends them in a new direction when they are readmitted. And he would say they're readmitted. He knew that a reflection wasn't the same photon coming back. He knew that when light goes into a piece of glass, the same photons aren't coming out the other end. Yeah, come on. It's a translation of energy into energy into energy into energy, and then translated back into the form it started out in. That's what transparent means. It doesn't mean that something actually traveled through it unabated. It means that it was translated and then readmitted in the same language. It's like going in English, it comes translated into Russian, and then it's retranslated back into English at the other end. Anyway, so that's the foundation here is that I'm arguing that there is a level of incredible in terms of the detective work that has been done by science for the last 100 years in physics. They have almost with a deliberateness, it seems, looked for UFO theories. They're at the crime scene and they start, it's like the OJ trial, they start coming up with bizarre scenarios. Well, maybe a bunch of South American drug lords, and they didn't have any tires to put around her neck and set her on fire, so instead they just cut her head off and blah 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 blah. But she's just using so much cocaine that obviously the international drug lords were just so important to get through this network of how much cocaine was going through Nicole Simpson's apartment building or condo. I mean, they're looking for this insanely silly explanation, and so it seems like they got religion. Niels Bohr there's a lot of religious physicists in the past. There aren't too many now, but there was a lot in the past. And this is a real problem in physics, in that it seems they're looking for the phantasmagorical resolution because they really hated the rigidity of what it was appearing to be, which was this incredibly deterministic universe, and that we were just mechanical machines, uttering bullshit that's been, the bullshit's been just piling up, and then we just spew it, after a million years of its creation. And they didn't like that. They didn't, that wasn't an appealing description of the beautiful universe. So they take the evidence, which is, okay, there's a light goes by a surface and it changes its direction. So they take that to mean, okay, we got to find out what the light is doing. We won't pay any attention to what the surfaces are doing. We'll just say the light's doing it. The light must be doing something. So they take the simpler element, heading for the more complex element, and then they see a change, and they're blaming the simple element, when it seems quite obvious you blame the complex element. Obviously. The hole in the guy's head is because there's a gun on the floor. It's really not that complicated. And instead of going with that obvious mechanical sense, they're sitting there speculating about laser beams boring holes in somebody's head. Even though the gun, is smoking gun, is still hot, is on the floor. Anyway, the smoking gun being 60 years ago, Feynman knew photons move in a straight line.
So the house stays nice and warm, so that's good. Alright, so I'm going to show you a video in a minute, but first I'm going to talk about why I'm showing the video and how it relates. And there's also a little bit of meta in here. In
So I did speed this up a little bit of meta. No, it's all meta.
sense that, meaning conversation about the conversation. Because this is the kind of thing I've been talking to Gary about over the years in science, and when he started developing his own scientific theory, is if we're doing philosophy of science, you get to start.
So the philosophy is science. See, this is just, you have it backwards. Science is the main discipline. Philosophy is the subcategory of the discipline. And so you just keep getting that wrong. You either have science right or wrong. There's no philosophy of science. There's no mushy bullshit here. There's explicit truths about the physical universe, and you mushheads just keep trying to put mush into the physical universe. You keep trying to put your philosophical God into the goddamn physical universe. And I'm calling bullshit on that. And again, this is... this only was initiated because these answers are so ridiculous. They really are UFO theories. Bent space, time, bent time, a dimension. Time is now a dimension, not a function. It's a new dimension. So there's not forward, back, up, down, left, right. There's somehow dimensional time. And it's somehow, even though we know that in all these dimensions time works the same way, that time never gets broken in any sense other than the fact that you see a clock move slower and you say time in that whole place is now different. The clock is correct instead of doing the obvious, which is saying, no, the clock is broken. We put it in a place where the field dynamics mean the clock can't possibly function normally. Instead of concluding the obvious, the clock is now broken because you're breaking it mechanically because the matter is being forced to do something besides tell time now. It can't tell time in the environment you put it in. It can't tell the same time, let's put it that way. No, you come up with this phantasmagorical, it's a dimension, and I can bend it, and I can mold it, and I can change it. You can't do any of those things.
Your own theory that has a certain gist, and it can be before a mathematician comes along, and that's all fine.
Well, again, all this before a mathematician comes along, all this unproven math. Again, give me show actual formulas, okay? Quit playing this game that you have this perfect math. Show the actual formulas that you say are fundamental and meaningful. And I'm just going to show you what those variables mean and how those variables don't mean anything. The two-slit math is kind of obvious. I mean, there's no hidden variables in the two-slit math. Okay, they just take the width of the slit, they take the frequency of the light, they take the distance to the target, and they take this idea of using the frequency of the light as an angle. Let's see how to put this. That because if you have a phase difference between light, you can create a staggered sine wave. A sine wave that doubles, or a sine wave that's placed on top of each other and increases the magnitude. And the fact that so it's really just including a sine wave into the math as really, and a sine wave can be understood as just being a curve this way. Just something that goes down and goes to a peak. So it can be thought of as almost a triangle, a V. And that's the only thing you're adding to create the fact that there's a differentiation between one place, another place, another place, another place, another place in time. But that's all it's doing. It's just creating the time factor in the equation. Nothing extravagant, nothing I would disagree with. I'm using the same mechanical circumstance. So it's not like there's some other variable in the experiment. The experiment only has these variables. It has the frequency of the light, and we know that the higher the frequency, the actual how do I want to put this? The object will move less distance. It's actually a smaller amount of intensity if it was one photon. So a single photon of one form of light will actually have less effect on an electron than the longer frequency. And depends on how fast you throw stones. Again, if I had two stones and I want to tip something over, if I throw the two stones really fast, I won't tip it over. But if I throw one stone and let it start to lean, and then I throw the next stone right when it's at the apex of the lean, then I can tip it over. So it's actually throwing the stone slower will be more powerful in terms of the effect. And that's what's taking place in this circumstance. But anyway, that's the only thing that's the variable that's creating the variance in the output. So as the slits get closer together, you're intensifying the environment, the field environment that the frequency of light is going through, and so whatever movement there is in the electrons that are re-emitting the photons, that change is realized in the target in the sense that the pattern goes wider because now the angle of diffraction is greater because of the tightness of the electrical field that you're creating between the two slits, the two pieces of matter. Anyway, I don't want to get into the specifics of the theory. I just want to get into the idea that the same variables exist. Quite obviously, I'm going to be using math that would be using exactly the same variables. There's not something special about the variables. By my theory, frequency is an important player in terms of how much movement you get in an electron. So quite obviously, the frequency of the light would change the angle of diffraction. So there's no dispute about any of the variables going in. So to talk about math as being the critical element here is nonsense. It's not the math that I'm disputing, although I am disputing that the math actually shows you the two-slit pattern, because it doesn't. It describes a pattern. It doesn't describe the two-slit experiment. But regardless of that fact, the math isn't in dispute. The explanation for why it why it happens that way is in dispute. So again, this argument has nothing to do with it. I'm not going to be giving you different variables and different math. I'm not changing the inverse square law of gravity. I'm giving you the correct explanation for why it exists. It's not bent space. It's field energy being shadowed from objects, causing an induction of acceleration towards each other. Induced acceleration. I'm giving you an explanation. And I'm explaining why gravity works the same way as magnetism. Why Maxwell's formulas are so close to Newton's formulas for gravity. Because it's the same function, essentially. The same rules apply. So the math isn't going to be changed substantially. It's going to change, but it's not going to change substantially. The same variables are going in. There's no quantum variable in the two-slit math. There's no special quantum variable. So, I mean, that it's just such a bogus cop-out to say I need new math. I don't need new math. I'm giving you the right explanation. There's no bent space math. The bent space math has the same variables in it that Newton had in his, except he didn't account for the sun's movement. That's the difference between Einstein and Newton. Einstein accounts for the sun's movement of its center of gravity, and Newton didn't.
But you should be discussing things with people. What the heck is causing?
Enough of that. Okay, it's some few technical difficulties. I really want to get to this stupid experiment.
Here's things I can understand. There's a battle between realism and localism. You can choose various things.
Realism and localism, this is all jargon to me. It really doesn't have a damn thing to do with anything. I'm so sick of these goddamn fucking titles you keep giving things. I'm not a localist, I'm not a realist, I'm not this, I'm not that. I goddamn am seeking a correct answer to a correct diagnosis for the scene of the crime. A correct explanation of what the fuck happened. Like evolution, I want a right answer to my origin instead of a wrong answer. And bent space is the wrong answer.
Well, realism versus locality. Basically, the major interpretations, like the loss of realism is that we say that when you can't see it, the object isn't here or there. The cat isn't alive or dead.
Yeah, whatever. Both of your explanations, all of your interpretations, all of the interpretations are based on presumptions about photons having qualities they don't have. There is no Heisenberg. There is no uncertainty about where the photon is. We just can't measure its location. It's the problem is our tools. And again, they don't even have an accurate a measurement of the mass of electrons or the mass of protons, because there's no theoretical way to measure them without influencing them either. There's no way to measure them in isolated space. You can only measure them by putting a field into them, and once you've done that, they're dampened by the entire field. So you're never going to get the right answer for what they are independent of anything in them. Just as I don't think you're going to get a right answer for gravity unless you actually put matter into the gravitational field. There's no gravity until the other object shows up to induce it. Just as there's no magnetism in a wire until you bring them there's no electricity in the wire until you bring the magnet into proximity to the wire.
Only affect their neighborhood, but the things are superimposed. They're multiple options at once. They're the qubit, where they're the electron.
Yeah, there's no such thing. There's no qubit. There's all this is bullshit. I really don't give a fuck. I mean, every one of your interpretations of these things are all nonsense. So, again, all of these leprechaun theory, boogeyman, Sasquatch, abominable snowman, this is all crap. It doesn't have anything to do with the evolution I'm looking for the fucking thing that has facts connected to it rather than imaginations, just imaginations of funny wavy things floating through space, no mechanics to it, nothing. When we know that the photon moves every time you make a clean experiment, as clean as you can make the experiment, you'll notice that the photon moved from point A to point B in a straight line.
That has up and down spin, both polarities until you check, kind of thing. Right. So a major idea in quantum mechanics that isn't the popular one among scientists, but it's also, not scoffed at, and people still do look into it. And this video will show you too a good metaphor way of thinking of it, and it's easy to think about because it's a realistic realism, and
it's realistic to you, but obviously it has no realism in the sense that it's completely incompatible with most of the experimental results. So let's understand that you can't account for it existing, because if this wave existed around photons, they would be detectable in other experiments, and they're not.
Applying the metaphor, and that's the idea of pilot waves. The idea that, there's one photon that goes through one slit or the other, but it's following on pilot wave. And what was proved, was it Bohm or someone? What was proved was that if there's a pilot wave, it involves a couple problems, not problems, but weird parts that you have to be willing to accept.
Right, weird parts like the photon is creating a pilot wave around it that's actually bent by matter if it encounters matter. So the matter is bending the pilot wave of the photon. And again, you'll not find any evidence that makes any sense. Exactly, the matter is made out of electrons and protons and neutrons. It's not made out of anything else. So you're going to have to explain how the pilot wave is somehow blocked by electrons and protons when electrons and protons can't do that in the natural world. The natural world, an electron by itself can't move a photon. The photon has to actually hit the electron for the electron to move the photon. Electrons by themselves can't create any field or any magnetism or anything that bends light. Light isn't bent by magnetism. It's only bent by electrons. So you have to put the magnetism into a medium and move the electrons in the medium to move the light in the medium. But otherwise, pure light, you can never bend it with a force, because it is a fucking force.
There's hidden variables, and the pilot wave itself, defies locality. It's like it starts here and is a standing wave throughout the whole universe. Right? If you know what a standing wave is, you have to start them, and it takes a while in the real world, and once you have time, then everything's going in the synchronicity. The wave is everywhere, and parts are just going up and down. It's a standing wave, they call it. And so that's what violates locality, is that this wave, the pilot wave of a particular particle.
Yeah, well, that's just a harmonic. So a standing wave is just a wave at the primary harmonic would be the first wave that would be standing, and then the next wave that would be standing would be the second harmonic, and then the third harmonic, and those are all the standing waves of a wave. So they're the waves in parallel. Which all it means really is that they're the waves that actually fit in the box. And so if you made the box a tiny bit bigger, then you have a little extra remainder energy, and that remainder energy will take the wave off at the pattern. So the pattern just means that it bounces once in the middle, and then bounces off the wall, and then bounces to the middle, and it bounces off the wall. So you have exactly the same, you don't have anything left over. And if you make the walls a little further apart, and you keep the ball the same speed, it's not going to do that. It's going to land on the ground in a different spot each time, so it's not a standing wave anymore.
And every particle has its own pilot wave, and all the pilot waves would somehow exist at once and throughout the whole universe.
Right, and there's no evidence that the pilot waves affect each other in the quantum world, where in the oil world the waves will encounter each other, and the waves will bounce off of each other. No evidence that that happens with photons. So again, not quantum related really at all.
Like the results you see in the double slit experiment. So it gives us a genuine choice. Some of us will prefer to hold on to the realism, give up the locality. Some of us will prefer to hold on to locality and give up realism. It's a very interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, there's no dichotomy. There's no anything. Again, you're using pattern and saying anywhere I find pattern, I'm going to sit there and assume the pattern is from the same source. And these patterns are all simple patterns. These are, again, it's a rope. I put a loop in the rope, by waving my arm, and then I can put 2 loops by waving it a little quicker, and then 3 loops by waving it a little quicker. That is so mechanically simple. The math in there is so fucking simple. And if you're going to sit there and say, every time I see this pattern, I'm going to say it's a photon wave quantum mechanical function. It's not. It's a simple pattern. On, off, up, down is a simple fucking pattern, and you're going to see it in all kinds of places. You even see it in, I think it's whatever, Saturn. The bottom of Saturn has a frickin' hexagon in it or something, or maybe it's Neptune.
Skeptics will try to, what's the balance where both of those are options? How is that like Cartesian and radial coordinates where they're both an option? What is that perspective? And just analyze that. And a lot of people will take realism and say locality is bullshit, or take locality and go realism.
Yeah, I'd say all this crap is bullshit. There's only the idea that there's these objects that aren't particles, these things called electrons and protons and neutrons, and that they are the constituents of what we call atom, and they're held together because of magnetic forces of attraction and repulsion. The electrons don't like each other. They're constantly repelling each other, and they're attracted to the protons, and there's going to be a balance between that pulling and pushing forces, between their dislike for each other, the sameness, and their attraction towards the difference. And that balance holds the atom together, but it doesn't account for all of the force of the solar system. For example, I could go outside the solar system and I could put a free bit of matter out there, and it's still going to sense the solar system. The solar system's gravity theoretically goes forever. Well, the gravity or the magnetism of the proton goes forever. The magnetism of the electron goes forever. Yes, it gets incredibly weak, insignificantly weak. But the point is that within the scope of its mechanics, there's still force radiating from every atom. The atom isn't just the proton, the neutron, and electron. The atom is the entire force dynamic, which means that the proton is still attracting things from the outside. It's just not attracting them strong enough to bond them. So there's lots of electrons would tend to just float around atoms because they still want to get to that proton. But the other electrons are stopping them from going too close because they're repulsed by the electrons. And it's those balances that are creating the energy that's being spewed, because the electrons keep moving. Every time the electron moves or accelerates, it leaks a bunch of quanta, a bunch of these photons, invisible photons, as EMF, electromagnetic radiation. And every time it starts and stops, it's outgassing this force, and that force ends up hitting something else in the proximity. Fuck, this is just not that complicated. It doesn't need a unicorn explanation.
Bullshit. And I think this video will help cut the one from the other, because it gives a really good metaphor.
Yeah, it's a metaphor, and it doesn't mean anything, and it's not really good. It's really bad in the sense it just gets people thinking that somehow these things are related, and they're billions of times on a different scale. The forces involved are completely different. It's another Veritasium video. I mean, he's completely glued to these quantum explanations for everything, and there's real physical explanations
for how a pilot wave would work, and why particles can do seemingly random things and not travel in a straight line, and yet it be totally deterministic based on the fact.
Yeah, there's nothing in there about all that randomness crap. So again, that's just a pile of crap. this is clearly a physical system would have all kinds of unrandomness, in the sense that there would be all kinds of atmospheric changes that are taking place at the same time these little oil droplets are being bounced up and down. They're obviously changing the atmosphere around them. There's going to be all kinds of eddies and currents that are going to blow them in certain directions. Nothing random about that. It's all caused by a physical circumstance. The shape of the container, all of that crap is going to influence it.
Bouncing frequency of a wave and the particle that's riding on the wave. So it's either no randomness versus no hidden variables, right? Or it's randomness versus hidden variables. You either get randomness or you have hidden variables. If you want to figure out something compatible with what we've seen already with our own eyes and senses. And measurement of...
I don't even know what that means. We've seen with our own eyes and senses. Yeah, and totally misdiagnosed with silly theories about photons going through both slits, and photons with radar, and photons with calculators. Yeah, it's all a pile of crap.
Devices. And even understanding there's room for misunderstanding how our devices work. It's clear to me, like 99.100% clear, that we have this choice. It's either randomness or there's hidden variables in the problem.
Well, again, both of those choices are bullshit, so fuck that. There's no hidden variable. There's a freaking obvious misunderstanding of physics. There's no extra, you don't need an extra variable in the two-slit experiment. All you need to do is recognize that, hey, the matter is doing something. You people totally take matter out of the equation. You just say, let's not pay any attention to any force dynamic that could possibly be created by the matter. So we're going to take electrons out of the picture, we're going to take everything out of the picture, and we're just saying photons are going through a clear, open slit, and there's no forces involved, there's no anything, and for some reason the photon is moving in a new direction. And you're not accounting for the fact that, no, the matter is the complex thing. The matter is doing a lot of force leaking, and it's kind of silly of you to expect there to be no force impact, and certainly silly to think there's no electrons in those slits.
The problem with the hidden variable thing is that means there's a hidden physics, right? Like you could have a physics that no one could ever...
I don't know why the battery's going dead on this camera awful early, but it is getting old. So this might just cut off, so we'll see how it goes. Hopefully it won't unsave.
World the same way, but inside they're constructed differently, but they act the same way. They actually are the same, and you can't look inside. They are the same. So, you know...
So he's just saying that you can have two different things, and because they behave the same way, I'm going to call them the same thing, that is, in my opinion, very unscientific. I mean, obviously it can be irrelevant. Okay, I can put one more atom on the tip of my finger, and it's not going to make much difference to the nature of the finger. I can make tiny differences. The differences in snowflakes, they're all unique. Well, who cares? Because we know what snow is, and we know the uniqueness is irrelevant, and who cares? Snowflake, snowflake, snowflake. Yes, that's possible. But there's no reason to sit there and pretend they aren't different, and that in a certain circumstance they'll behave differently. The difference will matter in one circumstance. In the circumstance of how messy my driveway is going to be, it's not going to matter. It'll be messy, no matter what uniqueness the snowflakes have. But in some other circumstance, a much smaller circumstance going into the micro world, it's going to matter what shape the snowflake is.
Everything's deterministic, but fundamentally it's hidden. Then that just explains what randomness is. It doesn't mean there is no randomness. It just means, well, randomness is determinism, where you're guaranteed to not...
Yeah, whatever. This whole playing word games with there's no fucking such thing as a random, pure random anything. It's just nonsense. It's all cause and effect. Alright, so this is the droplet video.
Because it's good, you should also subscribe to this channel.
I'm using this...
Well, it'd be nice if you posted a link, so it's kind of funny, a guy who complains about the lack of links in certain other people's videos, and he never links to anything.
...speaker to vibrate a petri dish containing silicon oil. Now, if I take this toothpick and I make a little droplet on the surface...
Right, now he makes a little droplet by pulling the oil up and then having it bounce back down. And this oil isn't just silicone oil, they're vibrating it, so it's being intensely vibrated by a frequency.
The droplet will stay there.
So it's on a speaker, so they're vibrating the atoms of the silicon. The silicon is, by nature, it's not like graphite, but it's very weak bonds between the individual atoms. And that's what's really being exposed here, is that you're basically, by creating any kind of frequency, you're just turning it all into sand. All the atoms are becoming separated, and the ones that are being vibrated. And when you pull some out, they stop vibrating. So the droplet is non-vibrating silicon. This is vibrating. So this is like a field of bouncing sand, and you have like a solid ball on it. It's just going to sit on top of it. Because the little atoms are just flying up out of the surface all the time, bouncing up and getting pulled back down by gravity, but they're constantly pushing up. You can't see the individual atoms, but that's what the individual atoms are doing.
Hovering above the surface.
Yeah, so it's hovering because, like I said, the speaker is dematerializing this oil, and the atoms are constantly there. So it's like a air hockey. So they're essentially creating an air cushion, but it's not air. It's made up of silicon atoms. Little silicon atoms are sitting here bouncing, going up and down, up and down, up and down. And this non-vibrating oil is real oil still, so it's just bouncing off this bouncing field of atoms. So a bunch of little atoms are coming up. This has adhesion because these atoms are still stuck together, weakly bound, but strong enough bound to stay together. And so the binding of these atoms is strong enough that they're just going to bounce on this little field of little tiny atoms bouncing up and down.
Actually bouncing, and it'll keep bouncing for a very long time.
Right, and the bounce is just initiated by the fact that he pulled it up and dropped it. So that's the initial bouncing velocity, and it won't be until that initial bounce through friction over time, very little friction, but a little bit of friction, force friction, as it starts to slow down in terms of its bounce. So it's like a basketball. You could throw it high in the air and it'll bounce, 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 and diminish. So eventually it'll diminish in terms of you pulled it out, and now the bounce will wear off, and once it wears off and it sits on the surface, then it will end up getting vibrated and it'll break apart because the vibration will now infect it.
Now, the reason for this is there's a little layer of air between the droplet and the surface. And the droplet...
See, he says there's a little layer of air. This is kind of interesting. You can see these little tiny lines here. Those little striations. I don't know whether that's a camera effect, but it is sort of interesting. I mean, I didn't see that before. I don't know. Yeah, you can see that. Little tiny droplets inside of the droplet. Little two-slit pattern right there. Anyway.
Bouncing so rapidly that layer never shrinks to about 100 nanometers, which is what it would take for the droplet to recombine with the oil. Now,
well, for it to recombine with the oil, it has to actually make contact with the oil. So it has to get vibrated. So the vibration has to be more physical. It has to actually have an electron get in touch with an electron kind of thing, forced together, and then the force will infect the droplet and make it fall apart and fall into the vibrating mass.
Every time the droplet lands on the surface, it creates a wave. But this is a special type of wave, driven...
All right, well, this isn't a real photograph of anything. This is simulation, no doubt.
...by the vibration of the oil bath. It is a standing wave, meaning that it's not traveling out. It's just oscillating up and down. So the droplet...
Right, well, that's just because of the frequency. So, depending on what the frequency, probably will change how big or small that wave ends up being. But it's just, again, the force dynamic, right? So you've got to just concede that every time the droplet comes down, it's covered with electrons. The surface is covered with electrons and atoms that are constantly moving. And so there's a force dynamic between those two things. And electrons don't like each other. And so there'll be a pushing away commensurate to that, and a peaking of the material. It can't combine as long as it's all atoms hitting it. Again, so I'm just saying that we can't see them, but it would just be like electrons being shot up. Or in the case of a air hockey, a bunch of air is shot up, and the thing is floating on the disrupted field. The particulated field, call it that.
Makes the wave, and then it interacts with that wave on its next bounce. If the drop lands on one side of the wave, it is pushed forwards.
Right. So now the argument is okay, so as this droplet goes up and down, obviously there could be lots of energy in this going this way that would also change where the droplet comes down again. So all it has to do is come down a little bit off, and it'll end up moving forward, and then it'll end up doing this jaggedy line of gaining a velocity, okay, based on the fact that it hits one side of the trampoline. and it will keep hitting. As it moves forward, though, it's going to go this way, and then it's going to go back this way. So it's going to do it in a very uneven way. It's not going to move in a very clean pattern, but it will move because it's going to hit a different field energy as it comes back down. So you can understand that as this surface gets bent, it means the atoms that are coming out of this side are coming at an angle. The ones coming out from the bottom are coming up straight. The ones coming out of here are coming up at an angle. So obviously the angle of those atoms, or electrons being shot from the surface, are going to push it in this direction or push it in that direction. Not that complicated.
And as long as the bounce of the droplet remains synchronized with the wave, it'll keep landing on the front side of the wave and getting pushed farther forwards. Droplets like these are known as walkers. The bouncing oil drops have been known about since the 1970s, but only recently has it been discovered that you can use these little droplets to replicate many of the strange phenomena of quantum mechanics. Now, obviously, this is not a quantum system. The droplets are about a millimeter in diameter, but you can think of the droplets like quantum particles, say electrons. One experiment that captures the key features of quantum mechanics is the double slit experiment. If you send a beam of electrons at two narrow slits, well, the electrons, rather than behaving like particles...
Yeah, why using electrons again? Electrons, it seems so wacky to me. I'm just going to keep saying it's wacky. But you can't shoot electrons straight, and they're so affected by any charged field. And so how do you even shoot them at a target without the target being charged? You can't shoot electrons somewhere without a charged field. I mean, or shooting them past a charged field, having a charged field and then turning the charge off and then letting electrons go through it.
And ending up in two clumps behind slits, they produce an interference pattern, even when you send each electron through one at a time. With walking droplets, the pilot wave goes through both slits, interfering with itself, while the droplet only goes through one slit. The droplet doesn't move in a straight line, though. It's deflected by its interaction with the wave. The resulting...
Yeah, it's deflected by the fact that it clings to surfaces, almost like any other mechanical thing. So it's a cling force rather than repulsive force. So really it's the electrons and the protons. So the matter has more protons, the wave probably has more electrons, so it's an attractive force rather than a repulsive force.